Hello, Asheville. Good morning. We have a special guest in the studio today, Todd Weatherly with Stucker Smith Weatherly Associates, a therapeutic consultation practice with strong alliances in the therapeutic treatment and recovery communities across the United States. Welcome, Todd. Yeah. And now we are recording. So, Todd, you told me in our pre-interview that you were actually on the board of that church, of the Haywood Community Church, when you all voted to approve the needle exchange system there, or the needle exchange program there.
Mm-hmm. I was, yes, and I think that as a board member, I'll speak to that very briefly. But as a board member for a nonprofit organization, your job is to, best as you can, help vote for the mission and purpose of the organization. So the Haywood Church serves a very disenfranchised community. They believe in serving individuals who are, struggling with addiction, struggling with homelessness, and in serving that community, and that do everything from giving haircuts to helping them with paperwork and getting food stamps and all of those things. And a needle exchange, of course, with the population they serve, is something that helps that population very specifically. And the statistics are pretty clear that it does. That for individuals who are suffering from addiction, especially where needles are involved, the likelihood is that they will seek care. That they are more likely to seek care if they're having a connection with another human being who might be a gateway to receive treatment. And so, very specifically, it does serve and help the population of people that they serve and they minister to. And so, I felt good about that judgment and that vote at the time. But I think that our question today, as you and I have discussed, is a lot about how does that impact the entire community? Not just the people who are being served by this church or any specific church, but how does it impact all the rest of us and the community at large? And
Yes, because people who are addicted, in my opinion, are anesthetizing, and certainly giving them clean needles helps them not contract any contractual diseases, but it seems to me that it also gives kind of some sort of official stamp of approval.
Right. There's some enabling there, maybe.
There's some. So, is there a practice of seeking to connect with the person on that level of, while you're using this to relieve yourself of the pain, are you also considering why you're in such pain?
And I have not. So I'll speak to it this way, because I'm not a person who's standing at the needle exchange, being the individual who's trading needles. But I think one of the issues that we see in community is there's the litter, there's the evidence that needles are, there's needles all over the place, and there's people who are using in the streets and so on and so forth, because they don't go very far. One thing I know is that even if they didn't have a needle exchange, they'd find a way, right? So we're also talking about the diminishment of communicable diseases. So there's an unseen element that's involved there. But I also think that it would be in just having some skin in the game for a person. If they're going to come and get a resource, then make sure that you bring needles. If you're it's called a needle exchange. So hey, why don't you bring one needle and one extra, or pick up some needles, or do something for the community? Is there a way that we can reach a little more into these people's lives and cause them to consider, hey, have you thought about quitting? Have you thought about going into recovery? Have you thought about seeking help? Have you thought about doing these things? Again, I'm not standing there. Maybe they're having these conversations, and it's something that does it look different in our community than it does in the community next to us? So, and I think this is where some of this issue comes. Hendersonville doesn't have one. Or there was one that I think was tried. I don't think that they have one, or the neighboring community doesn't have one. Are we drawing people into our community because we have a needle exchange and we have more of an accepting kind of way about us? It goes to this greater issue. Are we enabling? One. And where's the real problem? Where's the systemic issue? And this was part of our conversation as well. Is like, are we doing enough at the kind of the macro level, the government and systems and care entities level? A lot of these kinds of programs are crutches to a larger and inept system that is not caring for its people. Is our healthcare system really caring for people who suffer from addiction or mental illness? Is our government system really, giving us an infrastructure that is allowing these people to find help? I can tell you that as an individual who helps there are lots of people who can't necessarily afford care or don't know that services like ours exist. But I can tell you that when we find people that do, navigating the system of care is very difficult. It's like
So there's all sorts of obstacles.
there's lots of barriers to care, everything from a lack of compassion to just lots of rubric and lots of administration and lots of it's kind of like we see we saw this a lot for insulin. Somebody had raised the prices and the amount you had to do in order to get a membership plan. And I mean, you're talking about a person who's in an aging population. They couldn't navigate all the details that it took just to get the medication that everywhere else in the country seems to be readily available. And so if you increase the complexity of of a condition, say opiate abuse, and you confront it with a community that has a lack of compassion, you're going to end up in a spectrum of care, hard to navigate, hard to access, and then you end up with programs like needle exchanges. That's great, and yeah, the statistics do say that they help, but they're not addressing the larger issue.
They're a crutch.
They're a crutch. They're a crutch for an inept system, unfortunately.
How do you think we're going to be able to get past this?
Well, people say it's money. It's not money. We got enough money. If you look at the wealthiest, I mean, we could pull, Jeff Bezos is a nice target, right? If he gave up one of his yachts, then everybody at Amazon would have the kind of health benefits that they need. I've heard some statistics, some number like that. He's got more than one. Maybe he needs to give up two of his yachts to handle the entire organization. But when is enough enough? When is wealthy enough and powerful enough? When is it enough? When are the top 10% going to start paying taxes?
More taxes.
I think in some cases taxes at all. And so I think that we run into greed, and we run into I don't have any problem with capitalism so long as you take care of your people. It's like house them, feed them, make sure they're educated, make sure they have health care. Let's give them the basics. Let's make sure people are assured the basics. And that may mean that they get paid a living wage. I'm not saying people do nothing for the kind of environment they live in, but, how much fight have we had over just paying people $15 an hour? Can you imagine trying to live in an apartment in downtown Asheville on $15 an hour? You can't do it. We got people that are going homeless all the time.
What would Jeff Bezos say to your idea?
I think that there's a saying, and it goes. I think this is true for people who suffer from addiction, and it's true for people who are in any very insulary kind of condition. And Jeff Bezos lives here. The last thing to realize that's surrounded by water is a fish. If you live in an environment where you're so insulated from the rest of the world, you have no connection to the struggles of the day-to-day person, it's hard for you to have compassion for it. It's hard for you to even see it. Well, they just need to work harder, or they just need to get a job. I mean, we hear that even from people who do work jobs all the time. It's like, well, let's not deny that this person does need help. They have a sickness, and they do need help. And you know, it's going to be raise people up. You know, there's
A floating, the rising tide floats all boats.
that's right, that's right. And I think that if you know, there's some pretty strong principles that are even biblical principles that are like, look, if you claim to be a person of faith, then you also claim to love your neighbor, and you claim to, you know, find the lowest of us and help raise the bottom up. You know, raise people up from the station that they're at, especially if they're in need. You know, I don't see why I don't understand why the disconnect has happened. I don't know how to solve the disconnect, Debbie. I don't understand why, and maybe it's. I heard a statistic that, I mean, an overwhelming. It was over 60% of the people in the world don't have an internal dialogue, and they don't reflect questioning to themselves. And if you're not asking questions, it's hard to learn. If you're not reflecting on things, it's hard to learn. It's hard to gain perspective, and we find lots of people in these bubbles. You know, they only talk to people they agree with, and they live in very narrow areas, very very narrow kind of intellectual areas, and they form opinions that are also very narrow, and then never go outside of it, and they're isolated in these thought bubbles, if you will, and then they encounter something, and they don't have to have compassion for it because they're not impacted by it, they're not connected to it, and the principles that they may say that they live by are also not connected to how they treat that person. And you know, how do we solve this problem? You know, we've taken a wide circle here, but I think that you know, is it education? Is it more involvement from churches? Is it better government? You know, there's so many avenues through which one could start to address this issue. I'm not sure which one's the most important. What's the card that makes the rest of them fall?
Well, in our history, we have to come to a crisis point, like we did in the 30s with the Depression and the New Deal, and things changing to make life better for a lot more people and help people get off the street, basically, because there were a lot of people on the street back then.
Mm-hmm.
And that happened because of that crisis situation of the Great Depression. And in my own opinion, I feel like COVID set up a crisis situation for the country. And the federal government, the federal has to follow up on what they did pretty well with getting vaccines out and getting people treated and inoculated. But that's not the end of the story, because I feel like just being very familiar with downtown Asheville and Asheville in general, a lot of people got put out on the street because of the COVID situation.
Absolutely.
And it's a crisis.
Absolutely.
And it's a national crisis because it's happening all over.
Well, and you've also got large corporations that are buying up properties and triple netting them out so that people can't afford rents. I mean,
Yes.
I mean, I think to me it's a crisis of consciousness, but I also think, you know, to your point, there was a crisis that happened long ago and people responded in a certain way, but if it's almost like because of social media, because of the internet, and because of all the access that we have, and the fact that we see crisis all the time, it feels a little like we're desensitized to it, so we don't respond to crisis in the same way anymore. It's just another shooting. It's just another needle in the street. It's just another person who died from overdose. It's, you know, we see it so much that we don't respond to it as crisis.
Crisis has become normalized.
That's correct, yeah. And that's a crisis. And there's a lot of us. There's a lot of people on the planet.
Yes, there's that. So we've been talking about your question here, what is solutions and how can we prevent this from becoming just symptom management with a disregard for community and other public safety? What is the deeper issue? I think we've been talking about it, but can we dive deeper into that? Or did we answer it?
Well, what is the issue and what's the solution? I said that there's probably multiple points, but I think that a person who intends to do, like, if you set an intent to do well or to create change, that you can do that has an impact. So I think people have to want to have change happen, and they have to believe that it can. And I think that, living with my family and my wife, I think there are days where you struggle with both of those. You struggle with believing that you can make any difference at all, and you struggle with what's a good idea that's going to cause it to shift.
So you mentioned your wife. Tell the listeners why you mentioned your wife, because she's in a unique situation.
She is. My wife is the executive director for Eblin Charities, and of course they serve individuals who are, can't afford gas to get to work, or can't pay off the power bill, and it's going to be cold, or they can't. They're going to lose their house or lose their apartment, go homeless if they don't have catch up on rent. So
and get up on the street.
They're serving. I mean, they just recently got their. Today is day 2 of the coat drive. I mean, you've got. I think about how many coats I've got in my closet, and then you've got people out there who don't have a coat at all. And that disparity is something, and they're trying to address the levels of disparity, where people don't have and try to give and try to make sure kids have toys at Christmas and feel like they've got, somebody knew and cared about them, or have a coat to keep them warm, or have food enough to eat during the week. I mean, it's they do a tremendous service, but again, I love, and it's dear to my heart, what they do. They are also a crutch to an inept system that fails to address the needs of its public.
So go ahead and tell the listeners about the coat drive and what they can do if they've got some spare coats hanging around their house.
They can, if you Eblin Charities, I forget where they're stationed today, but you can also
it's down near the hospital, I think.
Well, their office is down near the hospital. They actually have the coat exchange out in one of the parking lots with Ingalls. They stage it in a couple of locations, but you can always go by the office. The office is over just behind the hospital. You can look it up on their website. Their website is eblincharities.org, and you can find where they're located and drop off. If you've got coats for the winter you don't need and think somebody will use, they welcome your gift and will make sure that it goes to a good home.
Well, so I'm wondering then if perhaps voting more people in who are seeing the bigger picture of the just ineptitude of government here is part of the solution. I mean, I'm hoping there would be a solution here.
Yeah, it's getting people that have that willing. I mean, I think that I don't claim expertise where I don't have it, and I like to find people who know more than I do. Where I do know a thing or two might be in my field of expertise or what have you. I'm willing to tell you here are things that work and here are things that don't, and we base that off of good information statistics. This is how long it takes for a person to recover. This is how long treatment lasts, etc. I think about, maybe I could go for office and I could have some impact on these things. And I have that thought, and followed by that thought is an immediate feeling of exhaustion. And I'm like, ugh, that sounds like way too much. I mean, the kind of fight and popularity contest you have to do to get into office it's quite a bit. So finding people who are willing to step into those roles and be, you hear about it today, death threats, and if you have an opinion that's different from somebody else's, there's all this volatile activity, and you throw not only yourself but your family into the public view. I mean, it's not an easy place to stand.
It's not for the faint of heart.
It's not for the faint of heart.
I find that politics, like radio, attracts the best and the worst people.
Agreed. Agreed.
And so there's that. So, but there's somehow, some way, the Constitution set us up like this to do this constant infighting and adversarial positions, and they thought that it was going to work, and sometimes it does work.
Sometimes it does. Yeah. When's the last time you thought it worked? Like, I think looking at things that have worked in the past can give us some advice about how we do it in the future.
Our response to World War II.
Yeah. You saw communities come together. That was really something. I mean, I think that's as hard a time as it was. It's a time when, as a people,
As a country. And since then, it put us in the position of being the sword or the shield for the world.
Mm-hmm.
So it had very long tentacles in how the United States was able to rally and produce huge amount of munitions. And my dad was a pilot in World War II, and get people trained and get them over there. And when they invaded, when Patton and the Allied forces hit Europe, it was not even a year before they had defeated the Nazis.
Yeah.
So that was powerful, and we were also at war in the Pacific area too,
Mm-hmm.
at the time. So we have the resources, we have the grit,
Yeah, the grit.
and then how do we band together to solve these huge issues that we're dealing with?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of a good question. You know, it's almost like as a country, we came from a place of power, but now with the infighting and the everything else, and we've lost a lot of goodwill, I think, from that time because of how poorly we responded to things
Right.
at given times. It's almost like when a person suffers from personality disorder, from borderline personality disorder, they have a hard time with relationships, and they have a hard time with jobs, and they have a hard time with just stability throughout their life. And it's almost like, as a country, we're suffering from that a little bit. We can't get out of our own way to really solve some of these problems.
So we have an overarching personality defect.
You know, this was what, 3 or 4 years ago. They talked about taking narcissistic personality disorder out of the DSM-5, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual for psychological disorders, because it was so prominent that it no longer started to qualify as an actual disorder. It's common. It's normalized. I was like, that sounds bad to me. It did not, in fact, happen, but somebody recommended it because of how prominent it was. I was like, wow. Me and mine, the me and mine idea.
So, Todd, I know you travel around the country giving advice to other organizations. What's their feeling about what we're talking about needle exchange and crutching instead of dealing with the problem in an effective way?
Oh, well, the programs that I visit and go talk to and everything else, there's there's the division. So a lot of them are on the private pay side, which means that most people who are doing that are paying out of their pocket, not, insurance is covering very little or not at all, and they're paying a lot of money in order to get care because they can afford to. And they have the reason they exist is out of response to the government systems and the state systems and the hospital systems that, Band-Aids at best on the kind of care that a person actually needs, by and large. And so they are just as frustrated because they have to interact with those systems. And if you can forge relationships and get them to align and work, it's great. But that's so few and far between. It's why we actually, exists because people don't know where to find that kind of arrangement. We do. And when we get there, it's like, we actually know, if you talk about mental illness and addictions treatment, we actually know how to do a pretty good job of it. We have it, it's available. We know how to do it, we know how long it takes. We've got exceptionally sophisticated clinical models for performing the kind of care that people need, and yet we fail to offer it to the larger public on a regular basis. And insurance companies won't, they don't want to pay for it. Hospitals don't know how to change because they never leave their silo. It's an issue of disconnection.
And those people who can't get the help and can't get some sort of support are going to basically die on the street or institutionalized.
Or they're going to hurt somebody else.
Yes.
Or they're going to end up in jail, which is where most of those people are getting their quote unquote care, in prison.
And the jails are really not trained to do that very well.
No, they came out very clearly and said that we are not care.
Yes.
We are not rehabilitation.
So that mental hospital program that was started to be demolished more or less in the 70s or 80s under Reagan seems like at least, some sort of bringing some sort of care facilities back might help a little bit.
We had it here, actually. So this is in the 50s and 60s, leading up to the 70s when we had deinstitutionalization. But we had the Highland Hospital here. And, they were cutting edge care because they were a hospital that was connected to step down levels of care before a person was released. Now, in the 60s, of course, our ideas about therapeutic care were, they're dated, if you will. There are a lot more sophisticated ideas about care these days. But the hospital that they ran, and having you come into the hospital, but you go through stages of care before you leave and are released, that's a really good idea. That's the way it should be. But when we hit deinstitutionalization, and many hospitals just let all of their clients and patients go right into the street with no plan and no care and no nothing. And then they established a protocol, criterion for hospitalization is you're either a harm to yourself or you're a harm to somebody else. And it's like, just because a person's not a harm to themselves or a harm to somebody else doesn't mean they don't need help. There are plenty of people who are very, very, very sick. They're not going to harm anyone, but they need the help. And so we need to go back the other way a little bit. We need to find a better medium for what we constitute as care, and we need to address care as a lifelong approach, not just it's having a mental illness is not like breaking an arm. When I just put a cast on and it'll heal, you'll be fine. That's not what we're talking about.
It's not the same thing. Well, thank you, Todd. I'm going to introduce you again. We're getting close to the end of our half hour. I've been talking with Todd Weatherly, the Principal Therapeutic Consultant. He is with Stucker, Smith, and Weatherly, a therapeutic consulting practice with strong alliances in the therapeutic treatment and recovery communities across the United States. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thanks, Devine, for having me.